27. Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
25, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 13th of March, 2025 were read and signed. The General Secretary read the names of new fellows who were admitted to the Society. The following communication was then laid before the Society: St Mary Undercroft, Palace of Westminster, 1790 to 1870, misused, rescued and bedizened in gold by Dr. Elizabeth Hallam Smith, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, the 27th of March, and then adjourned the meeting. A reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear our paper. Our lecturer this evening, Dr. Abigail Graham, Fellow, was a lecturer in material culture and history at the University of Warwick from 2006 to 2019. She's a research fellow at the Institute of Classical Studies, University of London, British School at Rome, where she's the founder and leader of the postgraduate course in epigraphy, started in 2012 and continuing. She specializes in monumentality with a focus on experiencing epigraphy and reception. Recent publications include her book, Senses and Cognition, Experiencing Rituals in the Roman World from CUP 2024, and Introduction to the Romans, published by Routledge in 2020. We welcome Abigail to present her paper this evening. You will be stumped, puzzling portrayals of inscriptions and antiquarian societies in the 18th and 19th centuries. Welcome.
We'll take a nice dramatic pause. The screen slowly. But I would just like to say what a pleasure it is to be here. As has been set out, I generally specialize in the inscriptions of Roman Ephesus. And one of the things I've been trying to do in my research is apply cognitive methodologies. And rather than sounding like ridiculous jargon, what I mean is I'm trying to capture the experience of looking at inscriptions, what it actually felt like to visualize and focus not just on the text, but the experience around the text. Now, perception fascinates me because it doesn't necessarily require literacy. So if Greek is not Greek to you, that is fine. But what it does give us is a unique understanding of how our own lens shapes our vision. Another research project I've recently taken up is looking at Jonathan Turtlewood's excavations at Ephesus in the 19th century. And this has taken me into the strange and marvelous world of archaeology in the 19th century. And so I should set out, I am not a specialist in the period that I'm about to speak to. So I'm absolutely delighted to be in a room of individuals who do potentially have an expertise in this period. And I very much welcome comments or feedback on this wonderful world. As many of you will know, the Antiquarian Society kind of starts in 1707, it gets its formal charter in 1751. And a few years after this, a series of playful depictions of antiquarians forgeries becomes a running joke. And eventually, this is incorporated into well-known works of literature, such as the Pickwick Papers and Sir Walter Scott's Antiquary work. So I've been looking at these and wondering what is happening with these somewhat unflattering, at times ridiculous, yet infinitely entertaining portrayals of antiquarians. How do they engage with inscriptions? And how does this provide us with an insight into our own perceptions and our own engagements with these materials? And so it's a rare opportunity to view not just the materials, but how we as antiquarians are perceived both inside and outside of our hallowed academic halls. So without further ado, I'm going to hope this works. One of the first questions I found myself asking is, what is an antiquarian versus an archaeologist? I think one of the first times we find the word archaeologist is in Thucydides, the Greek historian. And you can kind of imagine him sitting in his home in 5th century Athens, scratching his voluminous beard, saying, what do we call someone who is interested in objects of the past? And when I looked up this word in my middle little lexicon, the translation in English was actually just an antiquarian. So it does seem at some time that these terms were considered to be the same thing, and that in some respects that Latin word antiquarian kind of took over instead of archaeologist. Another thing I found as I've been looking into what is an antiquarian is that they sometimes are viewed as collectors of objects, particularly in the 17th century. The term archaeology only kind of slowly seems to reemerge at this time. But a lot of the antiquarian collections that we have are presented in private museums. So I have this image up here from 1655. And what you see is a kind of collection of all these different objects put together. It kind of reminds you of in London, the Somme collection. These objects have been taken outside of their context. And because of that, the way we engage with the materials is impacted because it's a focus on the object rather than the story of kind of where it came from. And part of that is a product of how people are engaging with these. We don't have a lot of excavations going on at this time. So this starts to change in the dawn of the 19th century when we actually start getting excavations. So Sir Richard Colt Hoare, who is an esteemed member of the Society of Antiquaries, he describes the field as, we speak from facts, not theory. And this is at a time when he's trying to separate archaeology from anthropology as a discipline. And one of the first times that we see archaeology pop up, even in the OED, is actually 1824. So Colt Hoare, his experiences excavating Stonehenge with Cunnington are starting to shape a new idea of archaeology as something that is based in context. And that is also going to change how we look at things. I couldn't help putting Momigliano's definition online from 1990, where sometimes antiquarians get a kind of pejorative sense, a man who is interested in facts without being interested in history. So I wanted to explore what that actually means and where that kind of image of an antiquarian came from. So one thing I did, the OED is brilliant at having these wonderful graphs that show the usage of a word. And what you can see is the prevalence of the word antiquarian and archaeology not being used as much. And then kind of fascinatingly, from the time that excavations start to take place in Britain, we see it slowly creep up and being used more and more again. So in order to trace back the idea of the antiquarians, I kind of went back to the Enlightenment, this time when we're starting to question more how we look at things. And of course, I came across the beautiful work of Alexander Pope, who is yet another person who grew up in London, and where his father's shop was actually not far from where the Society of Antiquaries were meeting at that time. And one of the things that, that he looks at as an Enlightenment poet is, is kind of trying to define what this idea of antiquity is. And I kind of love this. Let our love of antiquity be ever so great. A fine ruin is one thing, a heap of rubbish another. And I thought that this was fascinating because how do we define what is a fine ruin and what is rubbish? And I think that is also kind of part of perceptions of antiquarians. And as a translator, so one of Pope's wonderful things that he did was write a translation of the Odyssey. But when he talks about literary translation, he talks about the importance of a smooth road, and that to make something that is a copy is something that isn't just something that echoes the literature, but echoes the experience for the reader. So when you read it, it's a smooth road. And this is his line between what is a copy and what's a caricature. A caricature gives you an image of something, but it's superficial. The experience isn't exactly the same. And interestingly enough, at this time, when we look at portraits of antiquarians, we also get some interesting things. So one of his later letters that he writes to the Earl of Burlington, which seems appropriate, in Burlington House, is to talk about the acquisitions. And again, this is where I trace this idea of antiquarians as collectors. So the Earl of Pembroke, Thomas Hebert, is collecting statues and dirty goods and coins. And there's actually a letter from 1772 that talks about how the Earl of Pembroke was extravagantly fond and thought himself a great connoisseur of antiquities. But after his death, there were found at the bottom of one of his ponds statues which he had purchased as antiquities, but later found to be modern copies and then just threw in the pond. And as it turns out, some of them weren't modern copies. But anyway, so this is where we get this concept of collectors and maybe not necessarily being responsible with the objects. And for Thomas, we also have we have his gardens in his house in Wilton House, and he is the president of the Royal Society. And what's interesting is, so he's acquiring these objects, but he genuinely feels like these things would be so much better if they had a text on them. So this is a Roman relief from the 1st century AD BC that we have here, and he added Greek text to these. So the Greek text of this lovely inscription, I'm just in my notes. So it says, Manthias of Atheus gives thanks to the gods for his victory in the boys' pentathlon. And on one level, I can see it, yeah, add something to it. One of the problems is, for someone like me, I look at this, and this is clearly a Roman carving of a Greek relief. So it's clearly of a later style, but the way that the letters have been presented on this, they're archaic forms. They're all capitals. So if you learn Greek in school, you're already a bit stumped because you're used to looking at lowercase letters. But in addition to that, there are also archaic forms, and it's written in what we would call boustrophodon, which is, they call it the lawnmower. So it's right to left, then left to right, then right to left, which also stumps a reader. So he puts a text on here, but it's not a text that's accessible, and it's not a text that makes a lot of sense with it. So this is how we get this idea that he is potentially kind of gilding the lily rather than someone, is it a copy, is it a caricature, does it make it better? So Sir Isaac Newton has this great quote, I can't imagine those men, but as enemies to classical studies, their pursuits are below nature. So this is where some of the negative perceptions potentially come from. But I want to talk briefly about this experience of being stumped when you look at something, because I think the cognition behind the experience is really important. So as human beings, we're constantly looking at the world around us, trying to predict what is going to happen. And when we predict something and it doesn't happen, which human beings is fairly often, we get this error code in our brain that says, oh, I didn't expect this. And what's fascinating is it's that error code that cognitive neuroscience has shown us is a major factor in attention and learning. So actually, when we get confused, when we get stumped, that is when we get attention. And that is how we learn. So rather than viewing mistakes and errors as obstacles to learning, they're actually a fundamental part of how we learn. So my first experience, one thing I've learned studying my fellow antiquarians is that in a bind, one of the first things you should do is blame another antiquarian. So I'm gonna blame my friend Dominique Bouchard, who sent me this lovely picture when she was at Rest Park for English Heritage. And she found this inscription knowing that I am a scholar of Greek epigraphy and said, oh, you know, Abigail, I don't think this is real. Spoiler, she was right. But I looked at it and I was like, this is Greek to me, isn't it? So it was I was definitely kind of stumped by this inscription. And again, what we can see are very archaic forms. There are actually 3 spaces at the end of a word, which we tend not to have in Greek inscriptions. That's a very archaic practice. But what's also important is the fact that Dominique was standing in front of the monument and I wasn't. And that has a powerful impact. So when we see this thing, one, it's made of slate, which we don't tend to find ancient Greek monuments made of. It's also an altar that is incredibly high. So the idea that you'd be able to put sacrifices on top of it, completely impractical. And then in addition to that, we also have this lovely bit of text on it too, which is in cuneiform, which no one could read. And so to understand this altar, we probably need to dig a bit more deeply into history. So this was built by Thomas Wright for Jemina Gray, Marchioness Gray, and Philip York, the Earl of Hardwicke. And it was one of her favorite monuments. We have this letter that she wrote saying, the altar has gained fame and praise all summer, made of flint and pebbles. 2 inscriptions, one, as someone told Mr. York, few people can read. The other, no one can. One in Old Greek and the other in strange Persic characters. Out of a book of travels, a very favorite spot with the Martian. So obviously, like she's, you know, it's more a marker of a space than, to be honest, I think she just loved the enigma that she's creating here. So is this supposed to be a copy? Is it supposed to be a caricature? Is it a great antique ruin? What it does do is definitely stump the reader. So from the first line that we have, it starts aniketo, and again, when I was taught ancient Greek, I was taught by, in succession, a British person, a Greek person, and an American person. And they all taught me different pronunciations. So all I know is that I probably don't know the right way to pronounce this. So it starts off with this opening phrase, aniketo theo Mithrai, which is invoking a Persian god Mithras. So these are very archaic letters and forms. There's an issue here because Mithras isn't widely worshipped until the Roman period in the 1st, 2nd century AD. So this is already about 800 years off of what the letters of the text should tell us. And then as we go through, we have some names that we recognize. That's fine, Cleander. And then they're talking about Ephesian kings. So this is also a problem because if this is from the 6th or the 7th century, we wouldn't have Ephesian kings. Ephesus is being ruled by Persians or Lydian Croesus. And we know this because at the temple of the Artemision in Ephesus, we actually have Lydian inscriptions from the time of Croesus. So again, this kind of doesn't make sense to me, but I'm excited because it's mentioned Ephesus, fantastic. Other weird things I notice, if you look at this text, there aren't any Greek omicrons. So imagine a text in English that only has E's and doesn't have any I's in it. I mean, it's a very kind of strange phenomenon. So then we get a bunch of these different spellings. And then also in the last line in green, you can see the green starts with what looks like a letter F, and that's called a digamma. And that's also a weird archaic form for the letter W. And that kind of doesn't really make any sense in this name. So I've been staring at this, trying to make sense of it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But once I learned the history of the monument and what was happening, I came up with another idea, which was that particularly this word doulos on the second line here, it's often translated as slave, which should be doulos. But one of the issues with that is that if it is actually the word doulos, it's the Greek word for trick. It's the Greek word that describes the Trojan horse. And telephanes can be a name, but it's also an epithet applied to the moon, which means far shining. So what if this really is telling us that it is a far, and again, which way do we read the text? Because it goes left to right, right to left. So if this were a kind of trick, we could also read this as a far shining trick of the great Megalo. And then on the next line, we have this weird, OF, and then it looks like onios. If you mess around with this a bit, what you could get is a name here of Dan W, and then Phocaeus as a hoax, and Epoe made this hoax. So can you read too much into this inscription? Definitely. Have I read too much into it? Quite possibly. But what's interesting is this inscription was actually written by a guy named Daniel Wray, who was a member of this esteemed society. And he actually grew up. He was good friends with Philip York, and so and published a book on Athenian letters of authors. He's also the person who got the cuneiform text. And what's interesting is he also contributed to one of the first volumes of Archaeologia that was published by the Society of Antiquaries in London. And he has this wonderful story that he tells about how he's wandering through a town, and he meets a man who's a sea captain who says, "Come back to my house, I've got some awesome Greek inscriptions." And he goes and he finds these Greek inscriptions, and there's one with old letters, and it's written in boustrophodon, just like the one we've looked like, very enigmatic. And then upon examining them, he realizes that it's just a list of names, and it's probably not that interesting. But he concludes by saying, there is enough to incite our curiosity at the manner of writing. And what he captures is, it's not just the written text, it's how that text is written down. It's how we experience it that shapes how we engage with the writing. So this takes us to our second puzzling inscription. So I came across this. It is from 1756. And so questions, have a look. What do you see? How does the manner of writing impact our perception? And why might learned antiquarians be stumped? So when it comes to dealing with this, I would say it is a truth universally acknowledged that an educated man in possession of an inscription must have found a truly unique and valuable object. Curiosity may have killed the cat, but it utterly ensnares the antiquarian who discovers a text that they cannot decipher, presenting a puzzle that that is irresistible. So this inscription is not a fake or a forgery. It's a modern text, but its visual framework deliberately mimics that of an ancient one. So for someone who's as Daniel Wray pointed out, the manner of writing is crucial. And if you're an antiquarian and you look at this inscription, as someone who studies Roman inscriptions, I look and I recognize Roman words. I recognized bene, honore, ter, bits and pieces of Latin inscriptions. And I thought, this is Latin. And I was made to feel infinitely better by Google Translate, because when I put this text in exactly as it is arranged, even Google Translate recognized it as a Latin inscription. So, and not to be outdone by Google, even Google was stumped, the algorithm. So while 18th century readers did not have the benefit of cognitive neuroscience, they definitely understood the way that spacing and the presentation of writing impacts how we read. Now, the critique of people looking at this inscription is not that the scholars saw Latin text and having recognized Latin, they ruled out any other possibility. But it's more that having seen the Latin, they couldn't see anything else. This is known in modern times as a kind of confirmation bias, where having chosen one course, we kind of reject any other information. And that then stops us from looking further, from thinking, how did the stone get here? Who might have made it? Why? So with 2 feet in the past, the learned scholars remain fixed on a kind of historical romance. And we see this, we have these bespectacled men all staring at the text, the man pointing at it. I still have trouble reading this for what it is, but if you take out all the stops, you get beneath these stones, repose Claude Coster, tripe seller of Impington, and his consort Jane. So it's definitely a fun way to kind of engage with this. What's also fascinating is that if you read the bottom of the print, it is dedicated to the penetrating genius of Oxford, Cambridge, that should be Eton, I don't know why it says Easton, Westminster, and the Learned Society of Antiquarians. So this is a cartoon that is directly addressed at the society. And probably not coincidence that, it comes out around the time that this society is getting footing. It also says that it's published according to an act of parliament in 1756. If anyone has any information on that, I would love to know. And it's published by Carrington Bowles, who had a local shop not far from where the Society of Antiquaries met. And though he was not a member of the Society of Antiquaries, his son Henry, who went on to make portraits, was. So that's why we have the lovely emblem to remind us how far and wide our field of influence is. What's fascinating is that this was not just a one-off. And in 1770, perhaps not coincidentally, the year the first edition of Archaeologia, the Society of Antiquaries publication, is set out for the first time, we also get a revival of this comic thing from a print seller in London. And what you can see is it's a kind of strange reverse. But they've actually made the writing even more difficult to read. And engage with, and yes, put the gentleman on the other side. So clearly, this was still something that was of great importance and relevance socially. And again, we're talking about things that are being printed, particularly in and around London. And it's printed, it says M. Darley. So a husband and wife published these comic prints. And they're Mary and Matthew. So the fact that they commonly abbreviate the publisher as M. Darley is not particularly helpful in this case. But what is interesting is that this printing power couple, we know a little bit about them. And Mary Darley was actually one of the first caricature artists that we have publishing things in London. And she actually wrote a book called The Female Connoisseur that was about caricature writing and was aimed not just at political satire, but also at voluminous wigs and outfits and dresses. So it was meant to include a broader kind of swathe of society. And apparently she wrote a book for gentle ladies, a book of caricatures for young and gentle ladies, fantastic, encouraging further artistic representation. And they also published the first image here of the antiquarian is an unknown image, but we have this lovely guy. Look at his spurs, his colorful clothes, his voluminous wig, his spectacular hat, his walking stick, even his sword. And of course, he is wearing spectacles. And what's amazing, you can't see it in this picture, but he's holding up a coin and he's looking at it like a beautiful magpie. The issue is the coin says EMP Otho. So if this was actually a Roman coin, it should be IMP, not for the Roman word imperator, not EMP for emperor. So this is a guy staring at a fake coin like it's the most wonderful thing he's ever seen and doesn't even realize it's probably not a real Roman coin. And what's fascinating is that Mary Darley actually did a portrait of herself, a caricature. So the image of a female connoisseur from 1772 is actually Mary Darley's representation of herself looking at a caricature. And I think this is important because the people who were doing these caricatures are not mean, they're not snide, they're people who, like the people they're making a caricature of, are actually embracing the fact that their lens distorts how they see the world, and they recognize it and are willing to make fun of it. And I think it's quite an admirable quality, to be honest. So this trend continues, and for gross exaggerations, that is a deliberate misspelling because the next person we will be looking at is a man called Francis Grose, who was large in mind, talent, and body. So when we see the corpulent image of the antiquarian, that is him presenting himself. And his first cartoon here is a bunch of antiquarians with what they call Boudica's night urn, which is basically her chamber pot. And of course, they call it something else, but it's also kind of hilarious that they're all there like with a supposedly mysterious object that everyone at that time would probably be able to recognize, and they're all grabbing at it, which is one of the last things you want to do with someone else's chamber pot. So it's a nice kind of way of presenting them. And of course, we get, again, similar issues of voluminous man with a wig, an elaborate jacket, a mole, a dog, walking sticks. And then in the next caricature, which he calls a fat and a lean antiquarian, we have two of the figures kind of standing side by side. Again, elaborate clothes, wigs, walking sticks, looking very dignified, thinking deep thoughts. So Francis Grose was also a member of the Society of Antiquaries, born in London, and he wrote a classical dictionary of the vulgar tongue, which had tons of interesting linguistic sides to it, including cant and St. Giles dialect. But he also wrote about antiquities, and he was also a friend of the poet Robert Burns. Now, if anyone here is Scottish, I apologize in advance because I'm not going to pronounce this correctly. When I was in high school, I had a British teacher, and he read Robbie Burns aloud, and we were all like, what language is that? So I'm obviously not going to capture the beauty of Robert Burns, but he describes him, if in your bounds you chance to light upon a fat fodral white, a stature short, of genius bright, and now he's caught in spurtle blade and dogskin wallet, and taken the antiquity trade, I think they call it. It's a very affectionate representation of Francis. And another one of his colleagues in his obituary, points out again how he was intelligent with exceedingly good humor, but he also loved to joke about his figure, and they kind of make comparisons to him and Sancho Panza and Falstaff and whatnot. So again, another person that is mocking antiquarians, but who is also himself an antiquarian. And this theme continues around 1800. The war with France and Egypt also brings more Egyptian things into the foray. So again, we have similar images. These are by Thomas Rowlandson, of people, again, always with the spectacles, always with the walking sticks, always with the elaborate clothes, always fixated on one thing and kind of ignoring everything else. And then we have this other image called the Veneration. And this, again, it's a kind of broken cup. This is definitely riffing off Francis Grose's midnight urn image, where this guy is holding what is obviously a cup, and his eyes are kind of like looking up to the sky, while this other guy in his spectacles, his hands are raised in an almost kind of supplication to the grandeur of this broken cup. And Thomas Rowlandson himself was an artist and engraver, again, born in London, joined the Royal Academy, who also made fun of himself. So he inherited like £7,000 from his mother when she passed away. and promptly put on like 3 stone. And so he has this caricature of himself, the discomfiture of an epicure, a self-portrait. And he also wrote a lot about caricatures and passions. And so, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the Enlightenment is that people are starting to question this boundary of what is rubbish and what is spectacular ruin, and what is beauty. And actually, Francis Grose was one of the first people to counter conventional aesthetics of beauty. And in one of his books, in one of Walpole's publications, he really kind of cuts into this idea of art being something that is something that is encultured. It is something that individuals appreciate, and people develop their own appreciation, and society helps us decide what we decide is beautiful. So it's also fascinating because philosophically at this time, we're starting to question art. We're starting to say, is this a clear and obvious line between something that is, just rubbish or something that is a spectacular ruin? So these are some of the exciting things that we have. And I think one of his things is this idea, his appreciation of art, they say, is not innate or universal, but yes, is emotive. So we move on from this, and things take a literary turn. And another really important thing is, now that we're having excavations, we're starting to realize the experience of excavating and the act and engaging with the context and the object is fundamentally changing how we're interpreting these objects. And what's also interesting is that the literary turn of these jokes is important because most of the things we've looked at are printed locally in London. So they're a small, specific urban audience. But once we get people like Sir Walter Scott writing, then those stories are disseminated across a broader scheme of society. So Sir Walter Scott, in his Scott's Antiquary, he is also an FSA of Scotland. And in his story, in his Antiquary in chapter 4, his main character is a guy called John Oldbuck, who is an antiquarian. And John Oldbuck has like a kind of like Scottish beggar guy that follows him. Again, apologize for the Scottish accent. Eddie Oakley, maybe is the way to pronounce it. So he's got a kind of wealthy patron visiting him, Mr. Powell, and he's trying to impress him. So he takes him out to, what's basically a ditch in Scotland, and says, hey, see this ditch here, see there's an inscription on it, ADLL. This is the camp of Julius Agricola, the governor of Britain. And this is what the inscription says. It says, Agricola decavit lubens. Agricola said freely and cheerfully. Now, if you try to check this in the incredible online website that is the Inscriptions of Roman Britain, which is fantastic if you're ever interested in Roman inscriptions of Britain, you will find out that the word libens as an abbreviated word happens 300 times in Roman Britain. Awesome. Lubens, never. So there's not, and the idea that we don't really know that Agricola also got all the way up to Scotland. So, there are some problems. But then what happens is Eddie comes along and he's like, wait. No. About 20 years ago, a bunch of Masons came and they kind of set up a channel through the ditch. And the ADD, or the ALDD, actually stands for something completely different. It's Aiken's Drums Lang Ladle. And my favorite bit is the description that Sir Walter Scott gives us of the antiquarian. He then ventured to steal a glance at our antiquary. Gentle reader, if thou hast ever beheld a visage of a damsel of 16, whose romance of true love has been blown up by the untimely discovery, or of a child of 10 years whose castle of cards has been blown down, John Oldbuck looked neither more wise nor less disconcerted. So it's he's very upset that his thing has been disproven, especially by this old Scottish guy who's tagging along. And he says, this is some mistake. never mind this old rogue. And so that is the, oops, have I skipped? I've skipped past that, sorry, that's okay. So that's story number one. We find an inscription that kind of makes sense, but actually doesn't make any sense. And then our main character, our protagonist, is terribly embarrassed by the Scottish person who comes up with an explanation that is both more believable, practical, functional. So a few years, or about 20 years later, Charles Dickens, in his Pickwick papers, relates a similar story. And I have to thank my husband for this, because I did not know this story existed. And when I was finishing my PhD, he said, oh, there's this great story about an inscription. You should read it. And so, although it's one of the last literary journeys here, I think it's a good one. So Pickwick goes out to the scenic village of Cobham, where he meets, he finds like a broken stone in the doorway of someone's home, and he knocks, and the man who owns it, he says, you know, is this an old inscription? And the guy's like, yeah, it's been here forever. And Pickwick immediately says, well, can I buy it? And he offers him 10 shillings. Pickwick's eyes sparkled with delight as he sat and gloated over the treasure he had discovered. He had attained one of the greatest objects in his ambition. He had discovered a strange and curious inscription of unquestionable antiquity in a manner of writing most unusual. So entering into a variety of ingenious and erudite speculations on the meaning of the inscription, a skillful artist executed a faithful delineation of the curiosity and presented to the Royal Antiquarian Society. Where else? And after this, he's elected to 17 different societies. And though no one could make anything of it, they were all positive that this inscription was absolutely extraordinary. Now, in comes this man who's painted as a villain, a jealous adversary, a Mr. Blotton, who says, look, I went back to the town of Cobham, and I found the guy who sold him this stone, and his name was Bill Stumps, and he said he was just bored one day, and so he wrote his name, Bill Stumps, his mark. And when you look at the inscription, again, it's not in the framework that we would expect, but suddenly it starts to make a bit more sense. Now, of course, the Pickwick Club, as might be expected from such an enlightened institution, received this statement with the contempt it deserved. The 17 societies unanimously voted Blotton an ignorant meddler and voted Pickwick a pair of gold spectacles, a token of their confidence. And to this day, the stone remains an illegible monument to Mr. Pickwick's greatness, a lasting trophy to the littleness of his enemies. And again, we have yet another inscription. This photo here is just a modern kind of remake of what it might have looked like. But yet again, we find ourselves stumped, not by the writing itself, but by the way that it's presented, by the context, by the situation. And what this shows us is the evolution of archaeology into something that is becoming something where context means something, and the visuality and the interpretation of things means something. And so my last bit here, which I'm going to abbreviate, takes us back to Ephesus, my favorite place. So Faulkner writes about his experience as an antiquarian, and this is something that we can all understand. You know, when a traveler is, and he talks about, so he visits Ephesus in 1842, and to get to Ephesus is a significant ride on a camel, probably an overnight stay. So he's there by himself. But when this book gets published 20 years later, the railway station out to Ephesus, to Hagia Souk, has just opened. So he's kind of imagining this world in which he won't be alone on a site, but there will be a whole bunch of other people. So he talks about being a traveler and the heightened emotions. Each stone becomes of interest. He examines the building and he wonders, you know, what peculiarities it may exhibit. So he kind of takes us through the mental process of the antiquarians engaging with the objects. But But what I find interesting too is that, and he describes, the process of putting all the pieces together. But then for him, one of the best things is, having realized this in his own mind, he points it out to the astonished eyes of his companions who can no longer resist the evidence of their senses. And I kind of love this because, yet again, this is a kind of fanciful idea. When he was on site, he wasn't surrounded by people who were like, oh gosh, that's amazing, you figured out the Artemision. He's there all by himself. And for a lot of us, if you've been to sites or museums and seen something, I am often fascinated by it. But the idea that there's a captive audience of people around me trying to listen or glean information is perhaps a bit more fanciful. The last time I was in Ephesus, I was trying to study an erasure on a statue base. So I had to get up really close to try and see if I could read some of the erased text. And there I am, scooched up, trying to take a picture, and I get pushed over by like a group of Dutch travelers, because on top of the base I'm trying to document is a sleeping cat. And nothing goes more viral than a cute cat pic. So the idea that that there's a captive audience for you as an antiquarian, that everyone wants to listen what you have to say, itself may be somewhat fanciful. And unfortunately for Faulkner, his plan of the Temple of Ephesus, of Diana at Ephesus, is really an exercise in fantasy, because it's not excavated by John Turtle Wood until about the 1870. So it's a lovely idea, though. So where do we end up with caricatures? One thing I would point out to all of to everyone here is that I don't think caricatures have disappeared. I think they've taken a new form in terms of how we represent archaeologists. And certainly one of the things that I like to look at are modern imagery. So although, what's interesting to me is that the decline in the word antiquarian seems to have been connected with these 17th century ideas of collectors, what Momigliano says, people interested in objects or facts without history. And if you watch the films in the Indiana Jones franchise, the villains, including but not limited to the Nazis, are connected. The French Belloc, the beautiful German Elsa, the nefarious American millionaire, they're all people who are more interested in an object's value than the story that it has to tell. So, and in contrast, we have the bespectacled Henry Jones, who's buried in tweed and manuscripts. And his character, he interrupts his rescue because someone broke a pot, and he's like, oh my gosh, is this a Ming vase? And then he realizes it's a fake, and he's really happy. He takes on a German plane with his umbrella. He has his spectacles. So he carries a lot of these kind of similar traits. And even figures like Marcus Brody, his friend, the archaeologist who apparently got lost in his own museum and who goes to a bazaar in the Middle East saying, does anyone here speak English or ancient Greek? It doesn't quite work out. And the question is, I don't think these are cruel satires from outside the discipline. I think they're comically endearing portrayals that acknowledge the limitation of any lens. Buried beneath the humor is a message of wisdom and humility. And Indiana Jones, too, could also be seen as a caricature of an archaeologist and a figure of contradictions. He's a man who proclaims objects belong in museums, but he hardly ever puts any of his objects in a museum. He's a professor who crawls out the window to avoid students in marking, something that many of us can relate to. He's also a teacher who says X never marks the spot, and 70% of archaeology is done in a library, but the only time we ever see him in a library is when he's looking for a relic, which is underneath a paraquet floor with a big X on it. And when he goes down and finds this relic, he breaks it and lights the whole crypt on fire, which maybe as an archaeologist you wouldn't want to do. So he's a series of kind of contradictions with similar themes, one of which is the danger of valuing an object's fame over knowledge, heritage, and context. Like the spectacular Grail, you needed to pick the cup of a carpenter. And also what happens when you take a message out of context. So inscriptions are always leading us astray. And we see this in the Indiana Jones movies where they found this headpiece of raw, and because the German person who had the piece, the inscription was burned onto his hand, he didn't have the inscription on the back. So he measured the stick at the wrong height and they were digging in the wrong place. So this too addresses this idea that inscriptions, can lead us off the beaten path as well. And then there's the famous bit where Indiana Jones is trying to save his dad, and he has to step on the word Jehovah, but forgets that in Latin, Jehovah starts with an I, not a J, and almost dies. So I think our world is filled with these kind of characters and contradictions. And my own mysterious encounter with an inscription made me realize how many of these difficulties continue to pervade our discipline, and how the lens we apply shapes how we see the world. It can provide focus, but it can also provide distortion. And if we want to carry our field into the 21st century, we need to look not just to the future, but also to the past. And we need to see how our admirable, what is admirable and ridiculous about what we do, and try and balance that lens. If we can't laugh at ourselves, and I think it wonderful that so many of the people mocking antiquarians are actually antiquarians, because it shows us we can. This is how we continue to be aware of the lens that we apply to the ancient world. It's how we correct our mistakes. It's how we continue to learn and become better. So rather than repeating our previous misunderstandings, let us be stumped by something new.
Thank you, Abby. That's a fascinating tour. I take sort of chair's privilege by opening the questioning. These inscriptions on sort of satirical publications in the 18th century, early 19th century, do we know how wide they're distributed? Because if they're widely distributed, they're presumably representing a knowledge of the antiquarian traditions at the time. And I'm just, is it a very narrow public that these are going to, unlike the modern cinema, which is reaching a mass audience? I just wonder whether we have any information on that.
It's an excellent question, and it's one that I've been asking myself as well, because what is interesting is that a lot of the pamphlets that I've shown are in numerous collections. So they have some at the British Museum, and some of them are actually in collections in the United States. But what I don't actually know is, I think those were acquired as part of other collections. I don't think in the 18th century they necessarily made it quite that far. But it is a question. I mean, it's fascinating. We can tell you exactly where they were printed, but we don't know how widely that material disseminated outside of London. And I think there's definitely an element of where the antiquarians are, there will be people who are interested in funny portrayals. And so one of the things I liked is when we see that there's a branch up in Scotland, and that this is all, as it's starting to disseminate with Walter Scott's work, then you can think, well, actually it's not just happening in London, it's probably being observed elsewhere. And at the turn of the 19th century, when we start getting excavations all over the country, so I think it is something that was probably disseminating more widely across the country as time went on. I think possibly when it started in the 1750s, 1770s, it's probably more of a localized thing, but it definitely, there's a case to be made for it expanding. But that's something I'll have to do more research on, I think.
Open the question, please.
Hi there. So looking at you know, the social and political context. Do you think that future antiquities will include things like graffiti, works of Banksy, even emojis, which are effectively modern-day inscriptions, digitally captured, because of their relevance of the social and political context and even their physical location, which gives them meaning?
That's a brilliant question. I mean, and it's just my opinion, but I do, because I think that the writing that includes those is a form of expression that is widespread, that is widely used, and how can you not use those elements? And I think what's interesting too is if you look at the use of decorations, even in ancient inscriptions, and the prevalence of abbreviations in Roman inscriptions, when you have a medium of things that are quite formulaic, quite short, like text messages, where people are kind of looking at it on the bounce, you need something where you can look at it and it's formulaic, and in a short amount of time, you can get the message very quickly. And this is actually where my engagement with cognitive neuroscience has been incredibly helpful, because there's been a lot of study about how we recognize, like the amount of time it takes to recognize in an emoji is a fraction of the time it takes our brain to decode a word. So by using pictures and facial expressions, all of those things, so by using those things, we are expediting the process of recognition. So to me, it's become part of our culture. It's become how people communicate. What I do worry, though, is that the language seems to evolve so quickly. Has anyone come up with a kind of urban dictionary of these? I mean, I don't use so many emojis because I don't know what they mean. And I'm going to end up like the person who thought LOL meant laugh out loud, and you know, used it in the wrong context. So I think, you know, you can potentially get in trouble for those things, and they also seem to evolve in meaning. So when I was using the smile with the wink emoji, I thought it meant one thing, and my daughter came home and she's like, "Mom." So I think one future difficulty will be, we have, you know, people encode Latin grammar, Latin dictionaries, but we don't necessarily think about explaining things. The more obvious something is, the less compelled we feel to explain it. So I do wonder, someone 100 years from now looking at, you know, some text message thinking, oh my goodness, A, can people no longer spell? And B, you know, what is this feast of images? And then like trying to guess. That'll be something for the epigraphers of the future, I think.
I wonder, when you have been looking into all of this, if you've come across much evidence of antiquarians themselves kind of refuting this characterization of their profession, either kind of individually or on an institutional level, that they're kind of pushing back against this idea that they're, you know, these kind of quite ridiculous figures, you know, poking around in the dirt for something that may or may not be there, and that they're kind of maybe, are they kind of aware or uncomfortable with this? Are they trying to kind of claim more authority, or is that something that you have come across?
That's a good question. I haven't necessarily come across people coming against that, but I think part of it is these discussions and debates would have happened in a pub or a meeting house. They wouldn't have necessarily published it in a work. One thing I've been trying to do is, you know, looking at some of these early publications and thinking about how people would have reacted to them. But it's not till at least 50 years later that we sometimes get annotations where it says, oh, someone kind of commented on this point as a postscript. So I think it's more difficult to chase down, but it is a really fascinating realm. So I'm hoping to kind of do a bit more of that.
Are there any other comments or questions? If not, can we thank Abby again for a fascinating talk this evening? Just before I do the formal bit, I've been asked to just note that there's a resonance, if you like, between this evening's lecture and our open Friday, next Friday, the 4th of April, which is on Fake, Spot the Fake, which is part of the April Fakes Day run by Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. Now the formal bit, I give notice that the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 3rd of April, 2025, when we will hear a paper after Tiffany, how the British arts and crafts movement transformed American stained glass in the early 20th century by Peter Cormack Fellow. The meeting stands adjourned. There's a drink outside. Please do join us. Thank you. That was fascinating. That's really interesting. Yeah. So it just raises all those sort of, where are these things circulating? Who's reading them? Are they? I wonder whether there's stuff in contemporary diaries that might lead.
Again,